What if I told you that Hollywood's golden girl Blake Lively is no longer shining under the spotlight, but cornered in a courtroom with evidence stacked against her like a ticking time bomb? What if the very friends she once relied on, Taylor Swift, Ryan Reynolds, and her own co-stars, are suddenly silent, watching from the sidelines as her entire image threatens to collapse? What if the text messages, the footage, and the whispers behind closed doors are about to flip the story upside down? Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on the scandal that could turn into the biggest meltdown in Hollywood history. And trust me, you will want to see every single twist. It begins with a silence so thick that every eye in the courtroom feels heavy. Every whisper feels like a scream, and every tick of the clock drags like a hammer strike against the wall, because everyone knows what is about to unfold is not a story that will fade quickly. It is not a scandal that will vanish with a clever apology or a polished red carpet smile. No. This is the kind of scandal that rewrites careers, that fractures friendships, that sets Hollywood itself trembling. And in the center of it all sits Blake Lively, the actress adored by millions for her effortless charm and golden girl image, now trapped in the glare of a legal spotlight that feels less like fame and more like fire. Her hands grip the side of the bench, knuckles, pale eyes darting to the towering stack of documents that just landed on the table courtesy of Justin Baldoni's lawyer. And those papers are not props. They are not scripts. They are the kind of receipts that can decide the fate of reputations with a single reveal. And as the air hangs frozen, you can almost hear the thought racing through her mind that somewhere in those texts, in those emails, in those forgotten threads of conversation, lies the spark that could burn her entire empire down. The drama had started months earlier when Blake raised accusations of harassment and distress against Justin. And for a moment, the world leaned in to listen, ready to rally behind her voice. But Justin did not step back. He did not shrink into the shadows. Instead, he came forward with a counter-move so massive it shook headlines. Across the globe, a $250 million defamation suit, targeting not just whispers, but the mighty New York Times itself. And with that, the game changed, because this was no longer about bruised egos or uncomfortable moments. This was a war staged in the open. A war fought with evidence, with strategy, with public opinion as the audience, and Blake, who once walked with casual confidence as though nothing could shake her, now found herself unraveling. And the unraveling was visible. In every tremor of her hand, every glance cast toward the exits, as though she could somehow escape what was about to come. Because Justin's lawyer did not come empty-handed. He came with texts, he came with footage, he came with witnesses whose very presence threatened to puncture holes in Blake's carefully crafted narrative. And when the first message was revealed, those in the gallery swore. They saw her flinch, swore they saw her eyes widen like someone who realized the door behind them had locked and the lights had gone out. The message was simple. A gush of gratitude from Blake to Justin, thanking him for his support on set, praising the environment he created and marveling at the teamwork they shared. And suddenly the room shifted, because how could the words in that text align with the story she told later? How could warmth and gratitude transform overnight into fear and accusation? The dissonance hung like smoke, and Justin sat calm at the table, almost too calm, sipping water with the patience of someone who knew he had only just begun. Because if one text could trigger such a reaction, what about the rest? What about the videos, rumored to show laughter over coffee? What about the behind-the-scenes clips where her body language spoke comfort, not dread? What about the whispers that she had demanded producer credits and bigger paychecks, only to strike with claims when those demands were denied? And the more people whispered, the more it felt like Hollywood itself was shifting away from her. Once loyal friends were suddenly quiet. Ryan Reynolds, no sarcastic quips, no subtle nods on social media. Taylor Swift, no cryptic lyrics, no veiled support posts. Even co-stars who once smiled beside her now sat in silence, as if guarding themselves from the storm. And silence in Hollywood can sometimes scream louder than words. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier it weighed. Because everyone knew loyalty is fragile when subpoenas are flying, when text messages are surfacing, when public opinion turns from sympathy to suspicion. And as the courtroom drama deepened, whispers grew of even more evidence tucked away. More emails, more DMs, more exchanges that could tip the scale further against her. And it was in that moment of suspense that the audience, both in the courtroom and online, realized this was no fleeting scandal. This was the opening act of something sprawling, unpredictable, and dangerous. Because once the receipts start dropping, they rarely stop. And with every reveal, Blake's composure cracked further. She shifted in her seat. She reached for her glass. Her hand shook so hard the water inside trembled, and one bystander swore it looked like she was juggling an earthquake. But the real quake was still coming, because Justin's lawyer leaned forward, ready to lay out a sequence of events that painted a very different picture than the one Blake had shared. And in that picture, she was not the victim. She was not the one retreating. She was the one maneuvering, playing chess with reputation's power and control. The whispers say she wanted more control over the film. She wanted her name not just on the screen, but etched in the credits as an executive producer. She wanted leverage. She wanted authority. And when denied, she shifted the board with accusations timed so neatly that the timeline itself became evidence. And while no one dares to say aloud what that means, the room itself seemed to gasp, as if realizing that ambition and accusation may have collided in ways that could not be easily untangled. And as this first wave of evidence rippled through the gallery, a sense of dread settled not just for Blake, but for what this would mean for everyone tied to her, for every ally who once stood close. Because if Justin's team was willing to put every message, every document, every scrap of evidence online for the public to see, then no one in her circle was safe from being dragged into the narrative. And in Hollywood, the fear of association can be deadlier than the scandal itself. Already insiders whispered that her friends were retreating not out of betrayal but out of survival, because when a storm this massive strikes, the safest move is distance. And the further they step away, the more isolated she becomes. And isolation in a city built on image is its own kind of defeat. The opening of this trial had promised fireworks, but what the audience got was something darker, more chilling, a slow peel back of the curtain to reveal that the glamorous facade may have always hidden cracks. And as the first day stretched on, the tension refused to ease, leaving everyone watching with one chilling certainty: this was only the beginning and the sea. Next reveal would not just shake a courtroom, it would shake the entire industry. The second act of this unfolding drama did not arrive with a bang, but with a silence that carried more weight than thunder. And when the courtroom doors opened for the next session, the press flooded in with cameras clicking like mechanical heartbeats, ready to capture every twitch, every glance, every unspoken admission that might flicker across Blake Lively's face. Because in scandals like these, words are not the only evidence. Silence is evidence, glances are evidence, hesitation is evidence. And in that room, her silence seemed to speak louder than anything she could have said. She sat poised, or at least tried to, but even the most careful posture cannot hide the tremor of someone caught between denial and exposure. Her eyes flicked to Justin Baldoni, seated with a composure so calm it bordered on unnerving. He leaned back in his chair, fingers laced together, a quiet confidence radiating as if he had already read the final page of this story and knew how it would end. His lawyer, however, was the one driving the storm with a rhythm that felt almost theatrical, a script unfolding not for the sake of performance, but for the sake of obliteration. He laid out texts in sequence, not random snippets, but a timeline meticulously, crafted each message layered upon the last like bricks in a wall until the narrative they built could not be ignored, and the whispers from the gallery grew louder with each reveal. One moment showed Blake joking comfortably on set, another revealed her excitement about the project, and still another painted her reaching for greater creative influence, and each piece struck at the foundation of her claims until the room began to tilt against her. The mood was shifting, and she could feel it, because when the audience begins to doubt the story of the star, then the lights begin to dim on everything that follows, and Hollywood is ruthless when the lights dim. It does not wait for explanations. It does not pause for apologies. It simply moves on to the next spectacle. The lawyer paused after each reveal, letting the silence burn, letting the image of Blake sitting there echo in the minds of everyone watching, and the longer he waited, the heavier her silence felt, because words could not undo what had already been laid bare. The texts were not hearsay. They were not rumors. They were her own words, and the more her own words contradicted the claims, the more the narrative twisted against her. The atmosphere grew so thick, even reporters stopped scribbling for a moment, as if afraid their pens might shatter the fragile quiet. And then came the suggestion, not yet evidence, but a tease that more was coming, that beyond the texts and beyond the video clips, there were emails, there were DMs. There were private notes that had not yet been exposed, and that tease was enough to ignite a wildfire outside the courthouse. Speculation. Running wild across social media, fans divided into camps, debates raging about whether Blake had misstepped, or whether she was being set up, and the lack of visible support from her famous circle only fueled the fire. Taylor Swift remained silent. Ryan Reynolds kept his distance. No witty jokes, no protective spouse gestures, and even fellow actors avoided statements as if the air itself was toxic. The silence became a headline of its own, and in Hollywood, silence can cut deeper than any accusation, because when the people closest to you do not speak, it gives the world permission to wonder why rumors began to swirl that some of her friends feared being pulled into the case through subpoenas, that if they spoke too loudly, they might be forced to hand over their own messages, their own communications, and no one wanted their private lives dragged into the storm. So silence became the safer currency, leaving Blake adrift and isolated as the court of public opinion grew colder and harsher. The lawyer continued, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with precision. Every detail lined up. Every inconsistency highlighted, every thread woven into a tapestry that painted Blake less as a victim and more as an architect of chaos. Whispers suggested she had pushed for a bigger paycheck, she had angled for more authority, and when those doors were closed, she shifted tactics, her accusations arriving like thunder right after rejection, and while nothing had yet been proven, the timeline itself began to feel damning, the suggestion of motive hanging in the air, heavy enough to crush whatever. Sympathy remained, and just when it seemed the tension might break, a new card was hinted at: security footage from the very day Blake claimed she had felt most distressed, and the footage showed something entirely different. Laughter shared. Over coffee, easy body language, moments of connection that did not align with the claims. The lawyer did not need to say much. The implication was enough, and the gallery gasped as if the ground itself had shifted beneath them. The footage was not yet played, but the knowledge that it existed, that it could appear at any moment, hovered over the room like a storm cloud waiting to break. Blake shifted in her seat, fingers tightening around her glass of water again, that same tremor running through her hand. But this time she did not drink. She simply held it, as if the cup itself was her anchor in a storm threatening to sweep her away. Justin, however, remained unshaken, the calmest person in the room, eyes fixed forward as though watching the inevitable play out. A man who knew that evidence was the most powerful weapon of all. The narrative had turned, and everyone could feel it. Insiders whispered that this was only the surface, that the legal team had much more to reveal. And the idea that these revelations might be released to the public, not hidden behind closed doors, but laid bare on websites for all to see, only amplified the suspense. Because in a world where screenshots travel faster than sound, the promise of full transparency was both a threat and a promise to end this saga, not with whispers, but with undeniable receipts. As the day closed, reporters scrambled to push headlines. Fans clashed online, and Hollywood itself braced for the aftershocks, because scandals of this magnitude are not contained. They ripple outward, pulling in everyone connected, and as the court adjourned, the image that lingered was not the confident star the world once adored, but a figure gripped by silence and unraveling under the weight of her own words. The suspense was unbearable, because everyone knew the next session promised more, and the more that came, the harder it would be to look away, and the harder it would be for her to climb back. By the time the courtroom gathered again, the story had already escaped the walls. It had spread like wildfire through every outlet, every platform, every conversation in Hollywood coffee shops and late-night talk show monologues. It had become more than a legal battle. It was now a cultural obsession. The kind of scandal that makes strangers argue in comment sections and old friends whisper on phone calls, because everyone wanted to know what was real and what was performance. Blake Lively entered the room with a face that tried to hold steady, but the weight of eyes upon her betrayed the cracks in the mask. She sat down slowly, carefully, as though each step might trigger a collapse. And once again, Justin Baldoni sat across from her, still calm, still steady, still carrying that air of inevitability that unnerved even those who wanted to see him shaken. His lawyer rose with the same deliberate patience as before, every move calculated, every pause intentional, and the documents he carried looked thicker than before, heavier not just with paper, but with consequence. The first order of the day was the mention of additional text chains, messages that had not yet been disclosed, and with that single announcement, the energy in the room shifted again, because everyone knew the first batch had already stirred chaos. So what could the next hold? Whispers ran like static through the gallery, and and even the judge had to call for silence before allowing the presentation to continue. The lawyer began not with the loudest accusation, but with something quieter, something almost casual. A series of lighthearted messages between Blake and Justin, discussing scenes, sharing jokes. Small details that painted a picture of familiarity and comfort, the kind of communication that stood in stark contrast to the claims of distress and discomfort. And as each line was read aloud, the tension grew tighter, the narrative more twisted, and Blake herself seemed to shrink further into her chair, unable to escape the reality that her own words, her own messages, were now the weapons being used against her. The lawyer moved carefully, almost mercilessly, building a rhythm, each message cutting deeper, each pause leaving room for the weight to settle until the atmosphere was so heavy it felt like the very air could snap. The gallery leaned forward, reporters scribbled at lightning speed, and social media outside exploded with fragments of quotes streaming out through live tweets and updates painting the picture of a star whose carefully maintained image was unraveling in real time. Then came the mention of emails, professional exchanges that suggested Blake had indeed pushed for more influence, more authority over the production. Requests for credits, demands for creative input. The emails framed not as collaboration, but as assertion. And when those requests met resistance, the timing of her allegations came into focus, like puzzle pieces falling into place. The lawyer presented this not as definitive proof, but as a pattern. And patterns can be powerful in the court of opinion, because once a narrative is planted, the mind begins to connect the dots, whether the connections are complete or not. Blake sat motionless, but her silence screamed the absence of denial, the absence of explanation becoming its own kind of evidence. The whispers in the gallery grew darker, some suggesting that what began as ambition may have twisted into retaliation, and while no one dared to say it outright, the implication hung like a blade over her head outside the courthouse. The story dominated every headline. But what stunned many was the silence of her closest allies. Taylor Swift still silent. No cryptic messages, no lyrical nods. Ryan Reynolds, no playful deflection, no defense of his wife. Hollywood peers distancing themselves more each day. The silence was deafening, and the absence of support became its own story, one that cut at the very foundation of Blake's public persona. Because image is not built alone. It is built through the reflection of those around you, and when those reflections vanish, the image dims. The lawyer pressed forward now, introducing the mention of video clips, behind-the-scenes footage rumored to show not fear, not distress, but comfort and laughter. And though the clips themselves were not yet played, the suggestion alone was powerful, because imagination fills the gaps, and once the seed was planted, it became impossible to ignore the contrast. Between the claims and the supposed evidence, the weight of this contradiction left the room still and suffocating. And as the day unfolded, it became clear that the defense was not rushing. They were not dumping all evidence at once, they were pacing themselves, carefully stretching the suspense, stretching the unraveling, so that each day, each session brought new shocks, new whispers, new headlines. It was a strategy designed not just to win in court, but to win in the court of public opinion. To keep the story alive, and Blake trapped in the center of it, unable to escape, unable to control the narrative as she once did. The whispers outside grew wilder. Rumors of private DMs, flirty exchanges that blurred the lines between professional and personal, screenshots that made even fans blush with secondhand discomfort. And while none of it had yet been shown, the mere hint of their existence was enough to inflame speculation. Did feelings cross the line? Did rejection turn to retaliation? No answers were given, only silence, and silence breeds the loudest conspiracies. As the session drew to a close, one final tease was dropped, the lawyer hinting at old communications stored deep in servers, forgotten messages waiting to be unearthed. And with that, the session ended, leaving the room buzzing with dread and fascination. Reporters rushed to file stories. Fans rushed to argue online. Hollywood insiders whispered about careers teetering on the edge, and through it all, Justin remained, unshaken, the quiet center of the storm, while Blake sat haunted by a silence she could no longer spin. The suspense only grew heavier because everyone knew the next reveal could be the one that shattered everything. In the middle of all of this chaos, when the dust should have settled, and the public should have had enough of the spectacle, instead the storm only seemed to grow stronger and stranger, because new whispers began leaking from behind the closed doors of Hollywood offices and law firms, suggesting that what had already been exposed was only the tip of a much darker iceberg. and that the figures we had been watching unravel on the stage were themselves pawns in a much larger and more sinister game. And people began asking, what if the real story was not simply about hurt feelings, bruised egos, and legal filings, but about a system that allowed this kind of manipulation to happen in the first place? What if the reason why names like Taylor, Swift, Justin Baldoni, and Blake Lively kept surfacing in the same narratives was not coincidence but design? And what if the machine that has built careers, torn them down, and rebuilt them was finally beginning to collapse under its own weight? The narrative at this point shifted dramatically, because insiders whispered about emails never meant to be seen, court documents that may never go public, and meetings that were erased from official logs but remembered vividly by those who were present. And those accounts suggested that certain people had been shielded for years by networks of influence, money, and fear. And when those networks cracked just slightly, the light that came pouring in revealed much more than anyone wanted to admit, and this was why the atmosphere around these cases had become so suffocating, so heavy, so electrified. It was not merely about celebrities suing one another. It was about the possibility that the old rules of silence and untouchability were no longer working. The public by now could sense that something enormous was shifting the way the industry works, and the fact that the chatter would not stop proved it. People on social media dug through archives of interviews searching for signs moments that had been overlooked, and suddenly phrases and expressions from years ago took on chilling new meaning, as if the people involved had been trying to signal something without ever saying it aloud. And when those clips began circulating again, they did not just fuel gossip, they ignited outrage. How could so many powerful figures have hidden behind polished red carpet smiles, while these truths festered behind the scenes? Every new rumor, every alleged leak added fuel to a fire already spiraling out of control, and fans who once adored these stars now questioned everything, wondering if their idols were complicit in something they could never have imagined. And then came the stories of executives panicking, scrambling to secure non-disclosure agreements, calling in favors with magazines and news outlets, desperately trying to control a narrative that had already spun far beyond their grip. And this desperation only made the public more convinced that the worst was yet to come, because why else would they fight so hard to silence voices unless those voices carried devastating truths? And the suspense thickened, because just when you thought you had the full picture, another crack appeared in the wall, another whisper leaked, and another moment of disbelief rippled through the audience that had been watching all along. And what made it worse was the growing realization that some of these revelations might never make it to court, that they might be buried under settlements or sealed filings. But the mere knowledge that they exist was enough to poison reputations forever. And here was where the tragedy deepened, because reputations, careers, marriages, friendships, even legacies that took decades to build could be destroyed not just by proven facts, but by the perception of hidden rot. And in Hollywood, perception is everything. This is why you saw the panic in the eyes of stars who normally glided through interviews effortlessly, now stumbling, struggling to maintain composure, because they knew that one wrong word, one misplaced gesture could become a viral clip, reframed as evidence of guilt. The more they tried to laugh it off, the less convincing it seemed, and the audience who had once given them the benefit of the doubt now scrutinized every micro-expression as if decoding the face of a criminal in an interrogation room. The suspense fed itself in an endless loop, and still the question hung in the air, unanswered. What was at the core of all of this? Was it really just about one legal battle? Or was that legal battle merely the spark that exposed the rot of an entire structure that had for years thrived on silencing inconvenient truths and rewarding loyalty with silence? What happens when silence no longer works? That was the question haunting Hollywood in these weeks, and it terrified everyone, because if silence breaks, then stories long buried would pour out, and none of them would be able to control the narrative anymore. And so the audience waits breathless, waiting for the shoe that has not yet dropped, waiting for the document that may yet leak, waiting for the confession that might surface, waiting for the headline that will finally make sense of the madness. But until that moment comes, all that exists is the haunting suspense that what has been revealed so far is nothing compared to what lies ahead in the end. What this saga reveals is not just the unraveling of individual reputations, but the collapse of an illusion that Hollywood has carefully maintained for decades. What began as a legal battle and a few shocking leaks spiraled into something far more dangerous, a confrontation with the very machinery that has long protected the powerful and silenced the vulnerable. The public has watched in real time as stars once believed untouchable stumbled under the weight of secrets they could no longer keep hidden. Every denial, every carefully worded statement, every desperate attempt to control the narrative has only fueled more suspicion, more outrage, and more hunger for the truth. What makes this moment different from scandals of the past is that silence no longer works. Social media has ensured that whispers cannot be contained, and even the hint of a cover-up sparks louder calls for accountability. The old rules of Hollywood, where influence and connections could bury a story before it saw the light of day, are breaking apart under the pressure of a public that refuses to be placated with glossy magazine spreads and red carpet smiles. The machine has cracks, and through those cracks we are seeing not just one story, but many. The greatest suspense now is not what has already been exposed, but what remains hidden. Everyone knows there is more. Every nervous glance in an interview, every evasive response in court, every sudden settlement only confirms that the full story has not yet been told. And when it finally comes out, whether through testimony, leaked documents, or someone brave enough to break ranks, it will not just redefine the careers of those at the center of this storm. It will redefine Hollywood itself.